let us now move forward to Mencius' political philosophy. Mencius is clear that benevolent government requires its appropriate institutional expressions. A carpenter requires the compass and the square. A musician requires the pitch pipes, and sages of the past made manifest institutions through which the virtues of ideal rulers are realized in the world. Quote, goodness alone is not sufficient for governing, while the laws, institutions cannot implement themselves. End quote. Mencius praises the model of the 9-unit system, the well-filled system. This system had presumably existed in the Zhou dynasty. It is a plan of equal plots distributed among 8 families, and the cooperative cultivation of the 9th plot. The 9th plot would provide revenue for the lord. There is no incompatibility between the equal distribution of the means of production among the peasants and the absolute need for ruling class and social hierarchy. The collective cultivation of the lord's field provides the most humane and least arbitrary method of providing a specified revenue for the rulers above. This mode of meeting the needs of rulers provides lots of time and resources for the 8 families to provide for their own livelihood. If the people are taught the basic rules of human relationships, this institutional arrangement will make a society in which the peasants will live in peace and harmony. Mencius believes that benevolent government, quote, must begin with land demarcation, end quote. But his political philosophy emphasizes the principle of merit in government. Confucius' defense of hereditary prerogative is due to his determination to preserve whatever remained of the legitimacy of the Zhou dynasty. This motive has completely disappeared in Mencius' case. The survival of the Zhou house is no longer a live question for Mencius. His mind is alert to the possibilities of a new dispensation. The stratum of wandering Shi had greatly increased in numbers and prestige. The old local hereditary nobility had greatly declined. Both King Hui of Liang and King Xuan of Qi were the descendants of houses which had usurped the power of the older ruling lineage. However, the ancient ideal of the universal polity and universal kingship had not disappeared. The emergence of the states of Qi, Chu, and Qin as superpowers brought the establishment by one power of a hegemonic supremacy in the Chinese world, or even the establishment of a new universal king. In this context, Mencius discusses the criteria of true kingship with rulers such as King Xuan. In his dialogue with King Hui of Liang, King Hui asks, quote, "How can the world be settled? Unquote. Mencius replies, quote, by unification. Unquote. This might be a view widely shared by political elite of the times. In this context, Mencius' emphasis on merit as opposed to hereditary prerogative was also widely shared. It was no longer necessary to persuade the ruler of the time that pedigree would neither save them nor lead them to ascendancy in the struggles of the late Warring States world. What distinguishes Mencius is the moral cast of his conception of merit. His doctrine of true kingship is that only a ruler prepared to establish a benevolent government within his domain will be worthy of true kingship, and will indeed prove worthy to survive in the new order to come. In a world in which hereditary legitimacy is threatened from all sides, King Xuan of Qi asks, quote, was it permissible for King Wu of Zhou to kill his lord Zhou, the last ruler of the Shang dynasty? Unquote. Mencius replies, quote, I have heard of punishment of the common fellow Zhou, but not of the killing of a king. Unquote. This is, of course, a direct application of Confucius' doctrine of names and reality. Zhou obviously no longer deserved the title of king because he had broken all the norms of kingship. This answer must have shocked King Xuan. It gets the basis of hereditary authority completely negated. Nevertheless, Mencius' doctrine is somewhat more nuanced than this. The famous Emperor Yao of old had chosen his own successor Shun on the basis of Shun's merit and passed over his own son. The same was true of Shun's choice Yu. However, Yu passed on the throne to his own son, thus inaugurating the first hereditary dynasty. Mencius' disciple Wan Zhang asks, quote, there are some who say that when it came to Yu, his virtue was inferior. He did not pass on his throne to the worthiest, but to his own son. Unquote. Mencius' doctrine must justify the sacred canonical history to which he is committed. It is based on the complex doctrine of the operation of heaven. He first of all rejects the notion that the sage kings simply might have resulted in a rule no better than the results of the hereditary system, since it would depend on the arbitrary choice of the ruler. Quote, Yao could not give the world to another. Unquote. Yao proposed Shun to heaven, and heaven indicated its acceptance in two ways. When Shun made sacrifices to the gods accepted his sacrifices. When he carried on administration, the people were obviously content. This shows that Mencius conceived of legitimacy as being based on popular sovereignty. the people's contentment is one of the indispensable criteria for heaven's choice of the ruler, since heaven sees with the eyes of the people. When Mencius speaks of the succession of Yu's son, he points to his intrinsic virtue. When he deals with adoption of the hereditary principle for the remainder of the dynasty, he must appeal to the inscrutable will of heaven. The will of heaven had determined that its mandate would be transmitted through a lineage. Under such circumstances, mediocre rulers may prevail for a time. Mencius points out that even in times of mediocre rulers, worthy ministers exercise enormous powers. Yi Yin banished the king Taijia because Taijia had upset the laws of Tang, the first ruler of Shang. Well, this is a clear illustration of Mencius' conception of the role which ought to be enjoyed by virtuous ministers. In a period when the hereditary principle prevails, only the most evil kings can bring the dynasty to an end. Mencius agrees that by heaven's dispensation in such a period, even relatively unworthy rulers who may not deserve the name of king may nevertheless enjoy legitimate authority. However, for ordinary men to obtain the kingship, they must receive the recommendation of a reigning sage king. So, it seems that Mencius regards the situation in which the worthiest rule as ideal state of affairs. But he accepts the inscrutable will of heaven in history. The heaven's will does not always move in ways corresponding to the pattern which virtuous men might prefer. Heaven confers the mandate on lineages as well as on sages. This points to the unfathomable aspects of heaven's will. Despite heaven's inscrutability, Mencius thought he could discern a general pattern in the operations of heaven in history. Quote, every 500 years, a true king should arise, and in the interim, there should be men renowned in their generation. Over 700 years have now passed since the rise of Zhou, and the 500-year period has passed. The time would seem to be ripe. It must be that heaven does not desire to bring peace to the world. If it did, who is there in this generation other than myself to bring it about? How can I not be discontent? End quote. He also says, quote, the appearance of true king has never been longer overdue than today, and the people have never suffered more under a tyrannical government than today. It is easy to provide food for the hungry and drink for the thirsty. End quote. On the one hand, Mencius has a strong sense of his own vocation and mission in the world of his time. On the other hand, given the doctrine that an ordinary man can be recommended for the true kingship only by a reigning sage king, none of this means that Mencius embraces claims to the universal kingship. However, in some sense, Mencius seems to regard himself as heaven's messenger to the rulers of his time. In the background of his dialogue with the rulers of his time, there is an expectation that the time is ripe for a restoration of the Tao. The people are thirsting for salvation. Mencius is aware that King Xuan of Qi is anything but a promising candidate for true kingship. He approaches him from where he is. He tries to persuade him at one point that he possesses within himself the spontaneous impulses which could be expanded into the heart of humanity and righteousness. But he uses rhetorical devices, arguing that under certain circumstances, the king's extravagant luxuries might be justified. He even uses realistic argument that King Xuan cannot possibly prevail by force of arms against all the armed might of the powers in the world. There are at least 8 powers, all as powerful as Qi. If one power becomes too powerful, the others will unite against it. It turns out that Mencius fails to turn such weak-willed rulers as Xuan of Qi from their greedy habits and conventional political views. However, none of this shakes Mencius' faith that the reunification of the world will be achieved only by a true king. Mencius' faith remains intact in regards to his attitude toward hegemonic system of Guanzhong, with its emphasis on peace through power and collective security. Mencius looks back on the old hegemonic systems of the late spring and autumn period. He feels that he can stand in final judgment on them. In the end, they did nothing to reverse the decline of the Zhou dynasty. He is convinced that the Tao will be restored only by a reliance on the 4 cardinal virtues embedded in the heart of righteous ruler. Mencius also provides us with the classical justification of the principle of hierarchy and authority in society in terms of the social division of labor. Xu Xing is the southern agrarian utopian, 农家, who believes that all men should sustain themselves by their own labor in the fields. Mencius says that he himself is utterly dependent on the labor of others for his clothes, his pots, and his plows. Mencius asks if the civilized world depends upon the division of labor among the 100 crafts, why is the most crucial craft of governing a less valuable form of specialization than farming? There must be those who work with their physical strength and those who work with their minds. Mencius gives an account of the civilizing activities of the early sage kings. What is stressed is their technical intelligence. Knowledge is one of the four cardinal virtues. In the context of discussion of the four virtues, it is basically a knowledge tied to moral judgment. In the passage concerning the establishment of civilization, we are told of Yi's use of fire to clear the forests, and even of the education of Minister Qi, who taught the people basic human relations. The sages seem to become social engineers who create the basic infrastructure of civilization. On the other hand, without the sages, the people are at the mercy of nature. They are unable to cope with their most rudimentary needs. According to Mencius, humans seem to require civilization to meet their basic needs. They are creatures made for civilization, but they seem incapable of initiative in the realm of proper family relations. The superior man is able to exert his will, his heart of heart, to utmost. He is able to extend his innate moral knowledge to acquire whatever technical mastery is required. What the sage is able to do in the first instance is to overcome his self-involvement and to extend his concerns to mankind as a whole. What distinguishes him at the outset is his ability to worry about the needs of others. Quote, Yao alone was filled with anxiety, end quote. His moral concern then leads him to do whatever is required to deal with the situation. The mastery of technical requirements follows almost intuitively from the moral determination. Having grasped the need for flood control, Yu soon grasps the principle that in carrying on flood control, one follows the natural tendency of water and relies on the natural contours of the land. If a man is able to activate his intuitive capacity, he will master the essential. The potential of the ordinary people for goodness is overwhelmed by the disabling effects of their primitive environment. Their moral capacities and their intellectual capacities are not operative. Here, the emphasis is put on the equality of their nature, but on the inertness of this potential, on the weakness of will. Mencius' view of human reality is complex. He emphasizes the potential equality and innate goodness of all men. He also stresses that this potential can be realized only through the mediation of a moral intellectual elite who can exert the mind within the mind.